We now have really two chapters. I'm going to introduce you both, by the way, and I think then if we okay, and then we can take questions after both of you finish. That would probably work out the best, I think, for time-wise. Anyway, Dr. John Kruse with Global Insights. John is a Dr. Kruse, PhD ag economist, and he's Global Insights. He really does leads their agriculture work. They do a lot of economic work, modeling work, and we have asked them to look at the kind of food demand and other agriculture production demands through 2050, do some estimates about how much that is going to be, and then we ask them to sort of say, freeze the land footprint. In other words, as you run your analysis, what happens? What kind of increase in productivity do we need? So John has done that, and he's going to talk about that. Then we have Dr. Kruse Fugile. He's the branch chief of USDA's Resource and Rural Economics Division. I'd say that Keith is probably the almost globally known as the expert on productivity. He has written extensively, and I must say we are Global Harvest Initiative. I'll put in a plug. We believe that there is a productivity gap. We believe it's got to be closed in a sustainable way, and we are working on an index. Farm Foundation and the Economic Research Service with Keith's leadership are working on an index, a gap index, a global gap index. In fact, we hope to, and we're working with them, partnering with them, and we hope to have that unveiled at the World Food Prize in October in Des Moines, Iowa. Anyway, we think it's an interesting project because hopefully over time it'll be prescriptive. In other words, well, okay, this year we made some progress here, we didn't here, and maybe here are some of the reasons why around the globe. So we're excited about that. So anyway, I'll stop. I'm taking your time. I apologize, John. So come on up, and then Keith, you'll follow him, okay?
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to speak to such a distinguished audience. I think it's a topic that is very relevant and very noble for our time. And so as I go through these slides, I want a little bit on the background of this. Our task was to quantify global food demand to 2050. And I can tell you that there are a whole variety of assumptions and different factors that influence that outlook as we go forward. What you're about to see is what I would describe as perhaps a conservative estimate. We've tried to look at the historical pattern of dietary change, looking at leveraging our forecast from IHS Global Insight on macroeconomics and population growth, exchange rates, all of those types of factors that ultimately influence a forecast. And so, the overall task is the same. How do we produce enough food to meet food demand in 2050 for 9 billion people, and yet do it in a sustainable fashion? And so the first of those factors in sustainability, that Bill alluded to, was land use. And I'll talk a little bit about a scenario that we looked at relative to this forecast that froze the footprint of land and what kind of productivity gap that created just by freezing one input. I didn't look at water, I didn't look at wildlife diversity, a lot of other factors that also influence sustainability measures. Now, I couldn't resist not putting in at least one plot that gives you some idea of dietary change. I picked the developed countries and I put together their meat consumption so that you could have some idea of how they compare across countries. And my only point with this slide is even in developed countries, the dietary mix is very diverse. And so when you look at this, keep in mind that as countries develop, whether it's in Asia or Africa, the assumption that they'll immediately go or move to westernized diets is probably not accurate, at least in the sense of consuming exactly the same type of meats, exactly the same types of grains. And there are lots of examples in the literature about this. And so when we looked at this study, one of the things that we considered very closely was looking at how cultures evolve with respect to dietary change. And so when you're projecting demand for food to 2050, it's really important to consider not only what is their income growth going to enable them to purchase, but what is their culture going to suggest in terms of how they're going to move forward. Now, I will say, as we looked at this, one of the single biggest variables in projecting food demand to 2050 is India. Now, India is, 80% Hindu, 20% of their society is practicing strict vegetarianism. How will those folks evolve in terms of meat consumption as we move forward with strong income growth in that country? That's a big question, a big variable. I would say we've been conservative in looking at how much meat they'll consume in the future. Now, the one point I would make here with this particular slide is if you look at the case of China, are we reaching potentially points of saturation for their pork consumption? That's been what's driving a lot of their meat consumption to date. And it's our expectation that they will diversify more over into fish and poultry and even a little bit of beef consumption. And that we're approaching that point where we're going to not see maybe a whole lot more consumption increase in per capita pork in China. In terms of total consumption for crops worldwide, what I wanted to do is give you some sense for how those things stack up across a lot of different types of crops. And when you look at this graph, one of the things that should become evident to you is that there's a lot of growth in oilseeds, there's a lot of growth, there's some growth in feed grains, and then there's also some growth in sugarcane. And so when you look at total demands, and this isn't just food demand that's captured in this graph, it's also industrial demand for things like biofuels and other industrial uses. It's also it also reflects feed demand for livestock. So we have a pretty daunting task ahead of us. And in fact, if you look at total consumption growth, our numbers show an 86% increase from 2000 to 2050. On the livestock side, we also have very strong growth. Now, one of the things you'll notice in here is look at the poultry side of things of this particular graph. Very, very strong growth going forward. And why is that? Well, if you look at the historical pattern of meat consumption, poultry tends to be one of the least expensive items for developing countries to purchase. And so it's one of those first things that once they get a little income growth, it transitions directly into consumption. The other thing is, if you look at poultry, it is probably the least controversial meat to consume from a cultural perspective. So in other words, where take the Muslim culture, where pork is taboo. In India, poultry is becoming more acceptable. Eggs, of course, is a very big part of protein consumption growth in India, but really some dramatic increases here. Now, I didn't put fish on this graph, but if we were to look at fish, in Asia in particular, the consumption of fish triples over this 40-year period, and a lot of that's coming from aquaculture. So how do all these numbers stack up? One of the things, or one of the intentions of this particular study was to highlight the differences between demands for various crops. And so we spent a lot of time making sure that this was done commodity by commodity, country by country, when we put these numbers together. Overall, you can see that we've got an 86% increase in demand. Okay, how are we going to meet that demand? Which crops is that going to be most important for? And what's interesting is if you look at countries as they develop, staples like rice or starchy roots or those types of products tend to decline in per capita consumption as they diversify their diets. And so what you see in here is a lot of pressure on vegetable oils, your soybeans, your palm oil, rapeseed, sunflowers, because those are usually the first and cheapest available sources of protein, and then the diet goes into meat. The productivity gap. Now, I mentioned this earlier. If you look at that top line there, that's a line with a major expansion in area to produce this growth. From 2008 forward, and notice I've jumped from 2000 to 2050 comparisons to 2008 to 2050 forward. This graph, this productivity, to meet the demand, we would need to add 61 million hectares of additional land in order to meet the demand by 2050. Now, what happens if we were to freeze the land footprint? And that's what the lower line on this graph is. That shows you the productivity gap. If we just restricted land to current levels in 2008, how much of a gap would we create in productivity? You just look at this graph and you say, well, geez, I don't know if that looks like a very big difference or not. Well, it's about 10%. And the implication, though, that it has for yields is rather dramatic. If you look at the acceleration in yield growth needed to fill that gap, and I just took soybeans as an example here, took the major producing countries. I could have also put China on here as well. But particularly the U.S. and South America that supplies a lot of this, it's a doubling in the pace of growth, in yield growth per year on a linear basis. So that's a very, very rapid acceleration. And so it's very important, the challenge that's ahead of us in terms of how do we meet this. It's probably, this probably indicates that the answer is going to be a combination of factors. This type of yield growth may not be attainable. And so we're going to have to do a variety of things to meet food demand. And one of those pieces has got to be yield, obviously. But we're going to probably have to do some other things as well. And where is this if we don't do anything? Where does this land increase occur? And I put this on here in part to illustrate that this is occurring in some of the most sensitive areas of the world. If you look at Brazil, for example, that's about 18 million hectares increase. A lot of it's soybeans, some of it's sugarcane. If you look at Africa, a lot of that's feed grains. Now, keep in mind when you're growing area in Africa, that's at very low yield levels. What if we could double their current pace of yield growth in Africa? That takes enormous pressure off of the acreage component. And potentially it's a realistic thing. I mean, obviously the technology's there. A lot of it is the infrastructure and getting it there and making it work. What about India? Again, it's a combination of factors. It's oil seeds, it's feed grains, it's perhaps a little bit of sugar cane as well in India. And then you have Indonesia. I imagine I probably have Jason shuddering to think 4 million hectares more palm oil. He's probably not real happy to hear that. But it's if you look at palm oil, typically is the cheapest vegetable oil out there to source. It has a very long shelf life. It's very appealing to developing countries to purchase palm oil. It's a very highly used product. And so even with some pretty robust growth in here on palm oil yields, we still need more palm acres. And in fact, this implies that we need to almost double palm oil yields in order to meet demand. And finally, the last thing I'll mention here is the Commonwealth of Independent States, or the former Soviet Union. We do have some area growth there. It's largely in sunflowers and a little bit in wheat. I would argue that part of that is recovery since the reforms that occurred there. But also part of it is supplying Europe, quite frankly, the biofuels industry in Europe. So a lot of things occurring. There's a lot of details in this analysis, and I've gone through it pretty quick, and I look forward to your questions about it. Finally, I guess I want to make one last comment. This study is conditional on a lot of assumptions, and one of those assumptions is that we get normal climate as we've experienced in the past. We've heard a lot about climate change. We haven't analyzed that specifically in this analysis, but it's a very big factor, and it's one of those things that we've got to consider. And things like biotechnology that can bring more drought tolerance or can deal with higher weather variation or different climate zones are very critical in a very critical tool in helping address that problem. A lot of other things that could be done. We've assumed policy as is. What happens if there was freer trade? What happens if you radically change the transportation infrastructure of Africa? What happens if India doesn't follow the historical culture and all of a sudden demands a whole lot more meat of whether it's beef, whether it's poultry, whether it's eggs or fish? What happens if it accelerates much faster than we've anticipated? That makes these problems even harder to, or this challenge even bigger to reach. So with that, I'll leave it to the question session.
Thanks.